Well, all right, AP Hug people, here we are. Now let's hope the internet decides to play nice as I continue my mountain week, a mountain visit, um, and we undergo the process of finishing up our times together. So here we go. We left off talking about the various explanations of states and nations and how they're unique and how they're different and what goes into them. And one of the things that can impact or influence their success, failure, their lives, generally speaking, is the concept of colonialism. And remember, the last lecture talked about the term irredentism, where you take land and you make countries, and part of that goes on in colonialism, and that the most countries in the world have been created, independent countries today, have been created as a byproduct of the end of colonialism with the concept of devolution. So here we go. Colonialism is the practice of establishing political dominance over people outside of your state for economic gain or political gain or just to get land or some combination of all three. So that's what it's for. It's for either a resource that you have, that you don't have. Remember, this goes back to the whole concept of mercantilism that led to exploration, that led to, America. List as many historical colonies as you can. What happened to these colonies? Just, think of about five. If you can come up with five places that were colonized by five different countries, because to sit there and say, America, Australia, India, South Africa, and because those are all British, that's not wrong, but that's not the best way to approach this. Try and think of as many different places as you can, and as many different places controlled by different countries, because the end isn't the same for all of them. Some colonizing countries really liked their colonies and tried very hard to keep them, and others didn't. So, why did the Europeans colonize? Sorry, grabbing my soda. If you can find the Diet Dr. Pepper cream soda all day. A lot of this is review. So this next portion of this presentation, I'm not going to spend too much time on because, well, it's world history and it's a hash of things that you've heard briefly in ninth grade, your middle school years, maybe elementary school. So who knows? Or heck, you have cool history parents. All right. We colonize for wealth. That's the first of the G's. Remember the three G's? Play nice. The three G's. This is the first one. Wealth, because, it starts with a G. Gold. And wealth came in lots of ways. I like this fact that talks about, yes, resources are a sign of wealth. Literally, gold is wealth. Land is wealth because from the land you get the other things, as well as labor and trade. So everything associated with the political and the physical and the human geography of all the places Europeans go, excuse me, are all facets of wealth. And remember, I said this last time too, colonies are expensive. And so when one is tapped, it kind of forces your hand to go reach another one to get the resources, because this is all about extracting resources, not, replenishing them. Some colonize for religion. There's your gospel. Spreading the Catholic Church, especially the Spanish empires of the 16th century and early 17th century. Philip II being sort of like the high bar of that idea. And then some for glory, for adventure, for something to do, to expand power, to make yourself famous, make a name for yourself or your kingdom. Kings and queens begin to do this because the more wealth you have, the more power you have, and the more power you have, the more you can do as far as influencing other countries and the economics or the political makeup of the world. So by all means, those three G's play a huge part in the colonization and the creating of colonies throughout the history of the world. All right, which leads to the Age of Discovery, as you know, also known as the first wave of European colonization, because there was a second one. So the 1500s, sorry, the 1400s or the 15th century it begins, and then we'll do it again in the 1800s and into the 1900s as well. And so the first part of the colonization is the New World. That's the Americas. That's the part of the world that they didn't know existed. Remember, everybody knew the world was round. The ancient Greeks even calculated the circumference, of the Earth, but they didn't know where all the land was. They didn't know the Americas were there. There were no maps. The Vikings knew, but they didn't write, so we didn't know what was there. And so when Columbus said he was going to sail west to go east, it makes logical sense if you don't think you're going to hit land between Spain, and all the way around over here to India. But he did. Africa was generally only used as a place to establish trading posts, pretty much truck stops along the coast, to resupply, to get slaves, eventually to get slaves, but initially to resupply, on the way over to the Caribbean and the colonies in the Americas at large. And this just remember taking a trip down memory lane, what went in either direction. These are raw materials that get turned into finished products. Then those finished products go here, and those finished products make their way back here, so that the empire, the king in this case, England or Queen, is trying to make as much money as possible. So if you can control all the resources, all the raw materials, you remember these are all English people, so they have to obey those laws. So if they write a law and they have to follow it, they're going to take their cotton and they're going to sell it to England only. That was one of the rules, for a price set by England, and England's going to turn that cotton into clothing and then send the clothing back to the colonies for them to buy clothing. It's brilliant, but really, really crummy. Or some of the stuff would go here in the trade for slaves. Most North and South American colonies had gained their independence by the 1800s. So from 1500 to 1900, all this is colonized, and by the time we get to the early part of the 1800s, with a few exceptions, most of Africa, most of the Americas are independent, with a couple notable exceptions, and that's here, and then the Caribbean, and then up here. Okay, so and here. Eventually, these guys are later. So, but they are all now independent. So yay. You're a British citizen after losing North American colonies. How do you feel? Now, a couple things to think about with a question like this. What type of British citizen are you? Are you a merchant? Are you one of the Lord's proprietors? Are you Joe Farmer in the field? Because depending upon where you are in the social stratus, are you a friend to the crown? You'll feel it more than others. Many people in England probably are like, whatever. It sucks, that's one less thing we own. We'll go get another one. But if you have economic interest there, then it's a big deal. So it really depends on who you are. New imperialism, that was the second period. That was the 1800s or 19th century. What is imperialism? It's a policy of extending your influence through either diplomacy or military force to already developed places. So this is not going to the moon and establishing a colony and starting from scratch. This is you making an offer they can't refuse militarily, or making an offer they shouldn't refuse diplomatically, and you make some sort of arrangement, and by the virtue of the arrangement, you end up taking control of a people, of a nation. And that's imperialism. It's where empire comes from. It's what Rome did. It's what the Ottomans did. It's what the Greeks did. It's what various Chinese people did, mainly within their own country. But those are more dynasties. But any kind of expansion, all the different Muslim empires, even some African empires, Songhai being one, and the Mali being another, and so I mean they exist. Aztec and Inca, they're everywhere. It's just taking people over, either militarily or diplomatically, sneakily, not sneakily, but diplomatically through treaty and arrangement. And eventually, those treaties just end up giving you all the power. There was a movement in the new imperialism was a 19th century European movement to go into South and Central Asia. That is South Asia. That's India and Burma and French Indochina at the time, which now is Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, those places, as well as Central Asia, which is Afghanistan, Iran, that part of Asia, and then into Africa and Polynesia. Polynesia, Philippines, New Zealand, Australia, the islands around there, Singapore, Malaysia, those places. So we've taken care of, okay, you're looking at me, this half of the world with the first wave of imperialism. So we can't do Europe because Europe's got all its people in it. So let's go here. And so we do. Stopping at China, of course. Well, kind of. All right. Okay. So what was the scramble for Africa? Yes, it was the process of invasion, occupation, colonization, and then annexation of African territories. So we went and invaded it, and then European countries set up colonies, and then they annexed it. And by basically, they just made it a part of their country, a part of England, a part of France, a part of Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium even got involved in this. Notice you don't hear Spain or Portugal. I like telling my world history students that Spain was sort of like the country that it's like that guy who peaks in high school. Like his greatest achievements were high school. The rest of the world, England goes on to college and France goes on to college. And they all go on and do great things. And he's there every Friday night, reliving the glory days. That's Spain. And he desperately wants to be invited into parties, and he desperately wants to hang out for a while. And then people just have no use for him. Spain. Not today. I'm talking about back in the day. Now, why? Let me move me. Why this scramble? 5 big reasons for this interest in Africa. 1, something to do. Let's go explore, adventures out there. 2, medicine. This is the technological advance we're talking about now. By the 1800s, countries in Europe, especially the countries that get involved in this, are fully stage 3 countries. Okay, they are developed economically. They are industrial at various stages of industry. You know that during this time period, we start to see changes in medicine through the epidemiological, I'm sorry, I butchered it, model, and we know that they exist, and it is because of things as simple as quinine, because malaria was the big killer. Okay, malaria kept pasty Europeans out of Africa because malaria wasn't an African thing. It's ironic when the Europeans go to the Americas, all the smallpox and all those things Europeans have been carrying around for years because that's where the animals were. Well, they didn't have the way to deal with malaria because it wasn't part of their daily lives. So medicine, the Industrial Revolution made it necessary to go get more resources. Okay, so there's a desire to explore, there's technology, and then because of that technology, we need more resources to continue that technology. And there are more people there. You have to remember that this is going to make your army larger, it's going to make your labor force, your workforce larger. The countries that get involved in this new imperialism they're hyper competitive with each other. And they go about this as a way to increase the size of their armies and to increase the size of their economies and to increase the size of land in their possession. But mainly it's resources and bodies to just outdo each other. And again, the last one If I have more than you, I am better because I have more. There you go. These are just some crash courses on African imperialism. Feel free to watch the old crash courses if you want. This is just a breakdown of who owned Africa. And surprisingly, France was barely first, and then Great Britain, and then Germany, Belgium, the Portuguese, they hung on, and the Italians. And then there were independent and other countries. Ethiopia remains independent the entire time until 1930. We talked about that in previous lessons. But notice these countries right here, especially these three, are really, really, really not in a good place with each other right now. And then you have the various alliances that lead to other various things. But these three, it's also worth knowing that Germany only has 8%, but Germany is also a very new country. Okay, Germany is 1860s, 70s. It becomes a country. Italy doesn't become a country until I believe the late 1840s. So they're new to this whole state thing. So the fact that they're involved right away is a whole different reason. That's just to kind of show that they can compete with the two big boys in Europe. After World War One, again, when you lose all your stuff. Germany lost all its colonies after World War One. Now, that is true, but it does not mean that they became independent. It means that they got either sucked up by other countries or became protectorates, but they did not become independent. So Germany lost theirs. And then after World War II, two major wars in 20 years. Remember, colonies are expensive. And so most other places just gave them up. France fought on. France tried to keep their colonies. Remember, France just wants everybody to be a little more French. Not necessarily a bad thing. France really liked their colonies, and so Algeria and French Indochina fought and gained their independence. What are the effects of new imperialism? Well, one, these are the boundaries drawn by the European countries when they decided to carve up Africa and also parts of Southwest Asia. They are not based on cultural borders. They're not based on what groups of people would be best served. They're based on resource allocation and availability. So whatever resource is in this border is controlled by whoever has that border. And even though there would be two groups who would be better served, or like one group could be split, or you could have two groups in here that should be split. Well, because of the borders, they just can't leave and go where they want to go. So the economic motivations for these borders, which makes these are superimposed borders. They aren't naturally occurring. Some of the borders may be natural, but they are superimposed, means they are put down, top down. A result of the mixing of national groups has led to ethno-national conflicts, like we talked about in the Sudan and in Rwanda, because typically the colonizing power is going to pick one group to kind of serve, not necessarily as their favorite, but to serve as the ones that they will with which they'll work. Okay, and sometimes it's a minority party, sometimes it's a majority party, but somebody's always going to feel slighted, and that tends to be one of the reasons for these struggles later on is the resentment harbored by the groups who are not chosen by the imperializing ruling country. Many colonies are left with inadequate finances or infrastructure. In most colonial situations, not all, but in most, the roads that were built, the harbors and ports that were built, the electricity, the electrical wires that were run, pretty much went to the European business houses, to the harbors where the goods were taken, to the mines. Like it was all the infrastructure was put in place to get the stuff out of the ground and out of the country. They did not establish infrastructure for the locals in almost all cases. So when they leave, when the colonizers leave, And these people are left to figure out what to do from an independent status. They are so deficient in roads and electricity and schools and buildings that they remain dependent upon their colonizers for help, and that's called neo-colonialism. So it's this idea that, excuse me, I am, I'm now in Nigeria, but I still need help, and it makes it very difficult for a lot of these countries to get ahead even now, or to get up even now, and it also adds to that resentment for their situation. And then this leads to this the concept of dependency theory, and periphery countries are just that. They're countries on the periphery that are dependent upon the core countries, the big countries, the countries of Europe, of America, and they become dependent on them so that they can never innovate and develop on their own. And it's they're almost like welfare states with a capital S. They're so poor that they just have to hang on and ask for aid from their former colonizer, as awful as that is. And that's the concept of dependency theory. And that ends the nation state part of this unit. We're going to go ahead and start part 2 now and knock this all out. This next part is going to be looking at borders, shapes of countries, what countries look, and what goes into that, and the benefits of a country being a certain shape or a certain size, and things of that sort, and what goes into the boundaries. All right, so here we go. All right, now, why are nation states difficult to create? Well, we talked about this before, okay? There are 68 places in the world that are called dependencies. These are areas of special sovereignty, okay? So that means they are kind of colonies. 43% of these places have a permanent indigenous population. 25 have no permanent population. Most of these colonies are in the Caribbean and in the Pacific Ocean. The example they give here is Puerto Rico. This is the Commonwealth of the United States. It is home to 4 million residents who are U.S. citizens, but they cannot vote. I was going to say something else about that. Oh, yeah, there are more Puerto Ricans in New York than in Puerto Rico. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. Okay. And then this is just a map showing you all the lovely little territories and commonwealths, and notice that the United States has some, New Zealand, France, Australia, the UK. These are all other places. Okay. Western Sahara is not considered a country because Morocco says it is, and they say it's not. Another one, Hong Kong and Macau and China are also some that they say that they are their own entity, and China would say no. Yeah. So there's even Christmas Island. Okay. All right. Here we go. So boundaries. Okay. Boundaries. Now we start part 2. A state is separated from its neighbors by a boundary. A boundary is an invisible line that marks your territory. It's invisible, but it is a formal region, because a boundary is a boundary. And even though you can't see it on the land, every time you cross the state line and enter a new state, you're given a welcome sign, so you know it's there. Historically speaking, before there were boundaries and before there were actual people going out using meets and bounds or the other survey method to draw the borders, frontiers kind of served as a soft boundary, a zone, a buffer. It's just a land where nobody lives. Like there's no one controls it. It's just a frontier, and where I no longer have control is where the frontier starts, and where some other group has control is where the frontier ends. So that was one way of distinguishing between places a long time ago. And then there are physical boundaries, and there are 3 types of physical boundaries, and they all seem to be commonsensical. One, a desert is an excellent tool for dividing states because it's hard to live there and it's difficult to cross. So deserts are a physical boundary. Whoops. This is a lovely. This is a lake. This is a lovely physical boundary. This is stop. This is dividing Malawi and another African country that escapes my mind at the moment. But this is the this is the physical boundary. Here's one state, and here's another state. That's pretty cool. So, oh wait, what happened? Okay, there they are. The other two boundaries are mountain boundaries and water boundaries. Again, mountain boundary, physical, very good. Well, a couple reasons. One, they're pretty permanent. Two, they tend to be sparsely populated. And then we have lakes, oceans, and rivers. These are also water boundaries. Now, these are less permanent. You know, you can dam a lake, you can drain a lake, you can move a river. Just ask the Chinese. Or the river itself can change its shape because of silt deposits and other things. And it's also less permanent because these are more easy to cross and navigate than either a desert or a mountain by the vast majority of the world's population. So the least best, but still physical and still legitimate. Again, there's your water boundary. Now, other types of boundaries are cultural boundaries, and there are two types of cultural boundaries. We have geometric boundaries. Those are the straight line, yeah, geometric, straight line, drawn on a map. The 1,300 mile straightish line along the 49th parallel that separates U.S. and Canada, and the huge chunk of trees that gets cut out on the border. This geometric boundary was established in 1846. Other types of cultural boundaries are ethnic boundaries, and this is where religions shift or languages shift. Okay, and it's important to note that this type of boundary led to actual, geometric boundaries. Okay, this is where the French people live, the French-speaking people live. France. Oh, sorry, France. Sorry, buddy. All right. Sorry, just scared my dog. All right. France. I won't do that again. You're okay. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. So why do boundaries cause problems? Well, aside from determining how to draw them, once they are created, once you have your state and once your state has its shape, the shape of your state has pluses and minuses, has challenges that need to be overcome. The length of its boundary with other states just affects communications and conflict with neighbors. If there is a disagreement over where a border should be, again, Texas and Mexico went to war a second time because they had disagreement over the border. And there are others. A shape can become part of a country's unique identity. Again, Italy's a boot. I always see Italy as a boot. When you think about what countries just have a shape that is so unique that you know them without any hesitancy, like Chile. I mean, you just know it. Shape also influences the ease or difficulty of administration. If you are a large country, getting information to everybody is potentially problematic. If you are a country that is an odd shape with mountains or other things, it gets difficult. Chile is not very wide, as you will see in a minute, but to get information early on in your country's existence from the northern end to the southern end, I mean, that could be a challenge. So these things all need to be taken into consideration. All right, continuing. Here we go. Boop. So there are 5 basic shapes of countries. The first one are compact states. And again, compact state, pretty self-sufficient. It's compact. It's relatively small. It's very efficient. It doesn't take a whole lot of time for information to get anywhere. It doesn't take a whole lot of time for laws or rules or technology or food to get from one place to the next. You typically see the capital in the center and all the information goes out. Elongated states. The potential problem here is isolation. Well, the northern part versus the southern part, or the eastern part versus the western part. If that's how you're elongated. Long and narrow. Chile. It's 2,500 miles long from north to south, and it's rarely any more across. It's 90 miles wide almost the entire way. That's pretty cool. England goes back up here to the idea of a compact state. I mean, I know England is long-ish. I'm talking about the country of England proper. But again, you're no more than 90 minutes from the water. That's very, very efficient. The third type of state is a prorupted state. Now, this is a state that has a uniform size and then has this random thing sticking out of it. And typically, it serves two reasons. One, resources to get to a port, or two, to stretch it out, or to change the shape, and then to separate two states that would share a boundary. So those are the two main reasons for a prorupted state. Bolivia would love to be a prorupted state because Bolivia is landlocked. But I think Peru was nice enough to actually allow them, about 5 years ago, to allow them access to the Pacific Ocean. And then we have perforated states. Now, perforated state, like South Africa or Italy, is a state that completely surrounds another state. So there's a hole, there's a perforation in that country. South Africa is an excellent example because it has two other countries inside its borders, two compact states. It's the advantages, well, you're surrounding two states. The disadvantages, especially for the surrounded states, because you are now completely surrounded by somebody, and you better hope they like you. And the Vatican City is one of those, because remember, the Vatican City is a state. There's also another state in Italy, and there's two in Japan, and there's two, and like I said, so that's a perforated state. So there's one left. We've done compact, which is ideal. We've done elongated, prorupted, perforated. What do you think? Let's find out. Fragmented. That's a state that has multiple parts. The United States is a fragmented state. Russia is a fragmented state. Turkey, Japan's actually an archipelago. You can be separated by water or some other intervening state or intervening obstacle. Russia, the United States is separated by both water for Hawaii and Canada for Alaska. So those are the five shapes that countries are designated. And then the fun part now is to try and figure out where every country in the world fits. Some fit more easily than others, obviously. All right. Now, another way that boundaries cause problems is how states are governed. And for the AP Human Geography world, we're looking at three basic types of government: democracies, autocracies, and anocracies. A democracy, citizens elect their leaders. This doesn't say, okay, again, we vote. We are a democratic republic because we choose people to make decisions for us. An autocracy is run the ruler makes the choices, not the people. In a democracy, the people make choices, ideally, and in an autocracy, the ruler makes choices, literally. In an anocracy, it's a mix of the two. It's got some democratic stuff, it's got some autocratic stuff. And the more I teach this class, the more I realize that that's not difficult to find examples of. So those are the three types of governments. Those are broad speaks, and I know that's broadly speaking. But once you establish your culture and you have your ethnicity and your nation, and you have borders that you now begin to govern, how you're able to overcome the challenges of your borders has a lot to do with how you're being led. Like if your leadership is making all the choices and you're living in a country that's just not geographically, ideal, then there's going to be potential problems. All right. This shows you a map of democracies, autocracies, and anocracies. And now, without having a key, which makes this a very bad map, there they are. I wanted to see if you actually. I'm gonna leave it here and see if you can figure it out. So there's also a fourth color. Anybody? And by the way, it's important to know that maps are. And there's a fifth color. Maps are a text. Maps are a document. Maps and charts can be a primary source. So here's one color. Here's another color. Here's another color. Here's another color. But then there's a couple different ones. There's this one, and if you remember yesterday's notes, you might know what that is. And then there's this one. Okay, so all right. Who can tell me where the democracy is? Anybody? Excellent, Sam. Democracy. Okay, now who can tell me where the anocracy is? A little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. Anybody? Anybody? Yes, good. China. I think. Let's see how wrong, because that would really stink. Oh no, they're autocratic. No, I disagree with that. Yeah, okay, I guess this would be an anocracy because you can vote in Russia. Um, and then, but what's that? Anybody? I'll do AO there. Okay. Anybody know what that? Oh, and what's that one? Huh? That's a failed state. Failed state. Pakistan. That's Afghanistan, and that is Libya, and that I think it's Libya. Yeah, and that is Somalia, and they at various points in times. Oh, look, there's even one there too. We're failed states. The Brazilian one is a somewhat democratic country. How about that? Somewhat democratic. Why wouldn't? And then of course no data. So there you go. Now, looking at this. Let's see this whole erase. No, that's not what I want to do. Looking at this slide really quickly, as I struggle with my fancy schmancy pen. Anyway, yeah, I'm really not doing anything like that on purpose to Russia, but just, okay. All right. So looking at this, do the colors surprise you? Do the countries surprise you? Does this surprise you? This surprise you? And then does that surprise you? I mean, is there any country here that you don't understand? Or, think about the countries that you have on your team in fantasy geopolitics. Like, does it explain why your point totals look the way they look? It's just a question. All right. I also find it interesting that they have. I can't tell what Israel is. I'm intrigued. Okay, moving on. Now, other reasons that boundaries cause problems. Excuse me. Democracies and autocracies. Well, democracies and autocracies have three essential differences. Okay. All right. One, how leaders are selected. In democracies, we have procedures and institutions. That's called voting. In autocracies, there are kind of rules, but they're a little fuzzy. Sometimes it's tied to family. So that's one way they're different. Another way they're different is not only do we have the procedures, but we get to take part in them. Okay, we get to vote. In an autocracy, the rights of the citizens are repressed, if at all. And then the third thing is the concept of checks and balances. Our democracies tend to exist because they don't trust the government. Our country was founded on the principles of limiting the power of the federal government, Mr. President, because we didn't trust them because we didn't want a king. So there are checks and balances that are supposed to be put in place to make sure no one part has more power and to make sure that the voice of the people is not squelched. In an autocracy, the leaders exercise authority, and decisions may seem random or capricious, and they make the decisions as well. Generally speaking, that since the turn of the 19th century, so beginning in the 1800s, more and more countries have leaned towards democracy, but there is wobbling and wavering now. And democracy, again, has to do with systems in place. This is a political structure. This is not economic structures. This isn't socialism or communism. Okay, this is how the governments are established and how much control the government has over the rights of the people. And then this is just a line graph showing you the very same thing. Autocracies in red, declining after the fall of the Soviet Union, and in African places. Anocracies have tended, they've actually gone up with that. So there you go. Now, why do boundaries cause problems? Well, in America, voting, and again, boundaries are scalable. Okay, separating legislative districts, that is why we take a census, and those lines are redrawn every 10 years, and that's why we're counting people next year, because that determines how many electoral votes every state has, how many electoral votes are needed to be president. Right now, there are 435 districts, and they are redrawn every 10 years following the census, and they're supposed to be redrawn fairly, but they aren't. They are undergoing this term. And again, I love the Rubenstein textbook because one of the only times the state of North Carolina is referenced in this textbook is because of gerrymandering. Yes. Gerrymandering is drawing the lines to benefit one party over another. So if the Republicans in Congress realize, or sorry, if the Republicans in the North Carolina General Assembly realize, or in your state assembly, that there are fewer and fewer and fewer registered Republicans every year, that the country is becoming more and more Democratic, they will redraw the lines in such a way that that increase of a political party cannot cost them their jobs. And that's why it's illegal, because it's not representing the voice of the people. All right, so we're going to look at 3 different types of gerrymandering. Okay, we're going to look at wasted vote, we're going to look at excess vote, and then we're going to look at stacked vote. Okay, wasted vote carves up the lines in such a way that no matter if every single member of the opposition party voted the way they had the vote split up, they're never going to win. That's wasted vote. The vote is legitimately wasted. Excess vote is you put a disproportionately large number of the opposition party in a couple of districts so that they win those, they crush your party, but they don't win any others. And then stacked voting is what North Carolina is guilty of. Is when you draw a boundary that makes no sense geographically, like it doesn't use a river, or it's not a region or an area, it's some random snaky drawn thing that keeps the people of one party all right there, and it just makes no sense whatsoever. This became illegal in 1985 by the Supreme Court. It's just very, very difficult to do, and as you can see, they didn't require dismantling, so that's why it's still in the courts now. It's going to be in the courts now. It's a big deal in our state, North Carolina, and I don't think we're the only state who has this problem, but it's just a way for people to stay in power who shouldn't stay in power if the voice of the people was listened to. And it's not just a Republican thing, so don't go thinking all that either. It's a group in power that may be a minority group doing things to keep themselves in power. That's what it is in America. All right, so here's some examples. So here are 5 voting districts, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 red votes there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But there's 12 red votes there, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So here, the red wins, and here the blue wins, and the blue barely wins, barely wins, barely wins, barely wins. And here the red wins by the largest margin. Okay. This is, anybody? Which one is this? Let's go back. That's right. That's excess vote. Okay. This one again, wait. No, that's wasted vote, because no matter if they all vote, they're never going to win. This is excess vote, because look at that. There's 4 reds. That's overkill. If you could take, you'd only need 5. So if you just took these 5 right here, okay, and let them vote, or no, just do, wait, let's back this up. Okay, so these are the 4 people, so you would just need these, just do these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people right here, and they could beat them. Because if you put these 4 people here, then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They win there. So if you just move voters, you could run the whole thing if it was done the right way. So that's excess vote. That's overkill. And then this is stacked because these voting districts make no geographic sense. They aren't tied to neighborhoods or counties or districts. They're just drawn in such a way as to get a favorable outcome of one party over the other. Okay, so this is stacked. And this is excess. There you go. And this is wasted. Okay. Now, why do states cooperate and compete? So now we're going to change scales, and we're going to look at why states work with each other, and how states can work with each other, and how to deal with boundary issues. This is just another challenge of being a state or a country. During the Cold War, you had 2 groups. You had buffer states created by both groups. You had distrust. You had 2 different types of governments, 2 different ideologies. So in a way to keep a Third World War, because we'd had 2, or as I believe, 1 big one, these groups were created. So the Allies created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 16 democratic states, including the United States, Canada, and 14 other European ones. Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact, and it was the Soviet Union and all its satellite countries that it acquired after World War II, most of Eastern Europe, okay? And they served as a way to kind of keep the other side in check. The Warsaw Pact no longer exists. NATO still does, although current administration would like to defund it. They're designed to maintain a bipolar balance of power, and not in that sense, but in it should be dipolar, like 2 poles, like 2 groups of opposing forces that cannot come together because they're just too powerful. It's just to keep them from coming together. NATO's goal, stop communism. The Warsaw Pact goal was really, well, to provide a buffer for the Soviet Union, really. And then eventually they'll do some economic things together, and they'll try and work together, especially towards the end of the Cold War, during the time of glasnost and perestroika and things like that. They'll try to soften some things in the Warsaw Pact to help it grow economically, because out of NATO, one thing that's going to come out of that from a European perspective is the EU. Oh, speaking of which, it's formed in 1958. Notice the countries, okay? The purpose of the EU was to rebuild Western Europe economically. It was free trade across borders. It was just trying to get industry going and business going to help pull Europe out of the ashes of these last 30 years. Comecon, not to be confused with Comecon, was formed in 1949, and this is with the Warsaw Pact nations and other communist countries: Cuba, Mongolia, Vietnam. Vietnam's still communist, but just as there's more than one type of democracy, and that's a political thing, in the economic world, there's more than one type of communism, and there's more than one type of socialism, and so you have to be able to see that. And again, the promise of both of these was to share resources, to promote trading and share tech, and help everybody rebuild. In 1980, here is NATO in green. Actually, they're part of NATO and the European community. These people are NATO only in 1980. In 2013, they're still NATO only. Turkey wants to, and I know they wanted to for the longest time, join the EU, but part of the holdup is them not acknowledging to the Armenian genocide. They're still arguing self-defense. The purple here is the Warsaw Pact and Comecon, and then you can see that it goes away later. So there you go. And then you have countries that just don't join either. Okay. Oh, look, Yugoslavia. Okay. Oops. Now, in the 21st century, it goes from 12 countries to 27, and since then, more. The main thing with the EU is to help promote economic growth, to help smaller countries develop, to help kind of regulate trade and stabilize economies and make Europe ideally an economic hegemon that could compete with China and the United States. A couple of things to note is that, as you know, England left the EU. But even during that time period, England's currency they never left the pound sterling. But it was just a way to kind of help countries if they ran things the right way, if they were, just smart in what they did to keep them from going under. Some countries fudge books, and some countries did what countries do because you can't account for humans in leadership. But the purpose was to provide economic stability and growth, and to share and to help Europe come out of the ashes of war and be successful. Again, with Euro passports, you don't need one. The borders are open. It's called the Schengen area, and that's where you don't need a passport if you're an EU citizen. And this is European currency. This is the Italian euro, or I believe. The back of the currency, whether it's paper money or a coin, will have something about the country it's printed in, or one country itself. Like Ireland, you have the EU. On the coins, you have the EU stars on one side, and you have a harp on the other in their currency. There's always something about a country on a currency, and then something about the European Union itself. Another reason states cooperate is to help deal with terrorism. And terrorism is the systematic use of violence by a group in order to intimidate a population or coerce a government to meet its demands. It uses terror to move an agenda, typically targeted at civilians, or government officials, because that is the most horrific thing. Armies at war is horrible, but armies at war killing each other is what armies at war are supposed to do. Bombing, kidnapping, hijacking. Hijacking was the big thing in the 70s, hijacking planes and taking them to Cuba or Africa. Taking of hostages like Iran in 79 or 78, or assassination of leaders. Violence gets attention, it gets eyeballs, it gets TV coverage. I still think one of the best deterrents to terrorism or school shootings, which is terrorism, is to stop talking about it. Handle the situation at the school, help the kids grieve, let them grieve, because as long as I can only assume that by continuing to have it on TV, a kid's never going to get to move on. And again, the target is the primary difference here. Okay? And countries work together to help deal with terrorist groups. And also, like looking back at the EU, if you can help countries rebuild and become economically viable and economically solvent and sound, terrorists have less of an audience for recruitment. Terrorist networks are gangs, just like Bloods, Crips, MS-13. They're gangs, and they take advantages of situations, make you feel part of a family, make you feel special, provide food and resources. And then because they take care of you, you have to do your part. If the need for them was less, they would be less successful, I think. And again, this is the most famous act of terrorism in American history. Um, I don't want to say the world, because in other parts of the world there have been events that mean much more and resonate more with them. Um, it's worth knowing that it wasn't just Americans who died this day. Um, and then a little aside note, I did not. I was substitute teaching during this time period, and I didn't have a job that day, so I stayed home and I turned on the news and saw this, and I actually saw this scene live. I saw the second plane fly into this building in real time, and then I just watched this all day. And I've told students this in the past, and whenever it comes up, I always talk about it. My wife now, girlfriend then at the time, um, I just remember driving around Raleigh and it just being so eerily quiet. It was just quiet. Um, and the sky was full of planes because they couldn't land. They were all being delayed. No one knew what to do. And I just remember seeing the sky full of planes, just waiting for one of them uh, to fall from the sky because it runs out of fuel. It was a really, really weird, just really weird day. Horrible day, but a weird day. Um, there are two types. There is terrorism by individuals, and there's terrorism by organizations. There are several states, member countries, that support terrorism. Several Southwest Asian states support terrorism in recent years. They provide sanctuary, places for them to hide. Afghanistan is one of them. Pakistan has provided help. And there's a couple other things I want to discuss here shortly before we talk about this whole idea of supporting terrorism. They supply weapons, they supply money, they supply intelligence, they supply safe haven, they supply recruits. Um, and sometimes they use these groups to carry out their own agendas. I just want to say that before we start always talking about countries in Southwest Asia or in Africa or South America harboring terrorists, try and think about who put those governments in place, and also think about that, during other time periods, like we've always said, we'll go at war with anybody who harbors terrorists. Well, England has harbored terrorists before, Italy, France, and yet we don't deal with them. So we have to think about, the terms, the words we use, because yes, they do harbor terrorists, and yes, Al Qaeda war is one of those groups, but they're not the only ones. That harbor them. So we need to really think about who these countries are. And this is a compound where this is the Al Qaeda training compound in Afghanistan or Pakistan, excuse me. Now, whoops, one more. Iraq and Iran have been accused of providing materials to support others. Iraq has Saddam Hussein was told to have links to Al Qaeda in Iran. The United States accused them of harboring Al Qaeda members, of trying to gain influence in Iraq. It's worth knowing that Iran and Iraq went to war for a long time. And Iran's tie and connection to various terrorist organizations is also a reason why the United States and other countries, do not want them to develop nuclear technology for the fear of them developing nuclear weapons. So states and individuals can both harbor, train, fund, and use terrorist organizations, and that's another reason why countries want to work together politically and economically. Now, in summary, there are nearly 200 states in the world, member countries. It is impossible to find the perfect match between boundary and a single ethnicity. Almost. States are separated by boundaries, which can either be physical or cultural. Competition among states has been replaced in some places by economic alliances, especially in Europe. So the competitions that led to imperialism 1 and imperialism 2, and the scramble for Africa, and the protectorates, and the way that Southwest Asia was handled post World War I. All those things have led to terrorism because of the history associated with that. Has led to economic cooperation and political cooperation with things like NATO and the EU. So maybe there's hope. That ends Unit 5, our talk about how an ethnic group becomes its own state, becomes a nation, becomes a state, and then what you do once you become a state to move forward. How do you work to handle things um, within your own country and across your own borders? The next unit, we will look at once you become a state, how do you develop? How do you become successful economically? What do you do with the resources at your disposal, or how do you overcome a lack of them to move forward and become that next great superpower, to move deeper? Well, if you're a new country, to move into stage 3 and then through it from a developmental standpoint. And that's what we'll talk about in our next unit when we start looking at how states economically develop. All right. I want you all to take care, be well, review your stuff, and I'll see you soon. Peace.